Have you ever been in a room full of people and still felt slightly outside of it? Not physically outside. You're there, smiling, nodding, laughing at the right moments, and yet there's a quiet distance, like you're observing the interaction instead of living inside it. Most people think loneliness means being alone. Empty apartment, no notifications, no plans on a Friday night. But some of the most intense loneliness happens in crowded rooms, at birthday dinners, in group chats, at work meetings where you're technically included. And that's when it gets confusing. Because when you feel lonely alone, it makes sense. When you feel lonely around others, you start questioning yourself. What's wrong with me? Here's something important. Your brain doesn't measure connection by counting people. It measures it by sensing safety. Research on perceived social isolation shows that it's not physical distance that activates the brain's alarm system. It's emotional disconnection. The same neural circuits involved in physical pain respond when we feel excluded. Survival isn't about proximity. It's about belonging. You can sit next to someone, talk for hours, be liked. But if your nervous system doesn't register emotional safety, it won't log the experience as connection. That's why this kind of loneliness feels disorienting. You're socially fed, but emotionally undernourished. And often, it's subtle. In many cases, people who feel lonely around others aren't disconnected because no one is there. They're disconnected because they're not fully there. Think about what happens in group settings. You filter opinions so they don't sound strange. You soften reactions so they're not too much. You tell the edited version of the story. You laugh at jokes you didn't find funny. It's small, almost automatic. But over time, the more you manage how you appear, the less you feel seen. Research on emotional suppression shows that consistently inhibiting genuine reactions increases stress and reduces closeness in conversations. On the outside, you look socially smooth. On the inside, your body stays slightly braced. You're participating, but guarded. And guarded connection doesn't feel like connection. Sometimes, this pattern started early. If you grew up where certain emotions weren't welcomed, anger was disrespectful, sadness was dramatic, enthusiasm was too much, your nervous system learned something simple. Belonging requires adjustment. So you became observant, adaptable, good at reading the room. Those are strengths. But they create a paradox. You know how to fit in. You just don't always feel known. Attachment research suggests early relational patterns shape how safe we feel being emotionally exposed. If connection once required minimizing yourself, your brain may still assume that's the safest strategy, even if the current room isn't actually threatening. So you sit there surrounded by people who might genuinely like you, and part of you is scanning. Did that sound stupid? Am I talking too much? Not enough? That self-monitoring pulls you slightly out of the moment. Instead of experiencing the interaction, you start observing yourself inside it. You become both the actor and the critic. And connection starts to feel one step removed. There's another layer. Humans don't just need interaction, they need stable, meaningful inclusion. If your social world feels unpredictable, shifting friendships, performative workplaces, unclear relational footing, your brain stays cautious. And caution dampens warmth. It's like trying to relax in a chair that might collapse. Even if it never does, you never fully sink into it. So the loneliness you feel in groups, it isn't necessarily about rejection. It's often about incongruence. There's a gap between the version of you that's present and the version of you that's expressed. And the brain is sensitive to gaps. Here's an uncomfortable question. If everyone disappeared right now, would you feel slightly relieved? Not because you dislike them, but because you could finally drop the subtle effort. That relief tells you something. The exhaustion isn't from social contact itself, it's from social calibration. I realized this after a gathering with friends. Nothing went wrong. I laughed. I contributed. I played my part well. But on the way home, I felt drained. Not socially drained. Self-drained. I hadn't lied, but I hadn't fully shown up either. I chose the safe opinions, softened stronger reactions, agreed a little faster than I needed to. And my body knew the difference. Real connection reduces load. Performing connection adds it. That's why you can leave a room with no conflict and still feel tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. When you don't express yourself fully, your brain quietly fills in the gap. Maybe I don't quite fit. Maybe I'm slightly off. Those thoughts create distance. Distance turns into loneliness. And here's the irony. People who feel lonely around others are often the most socially perceptive in the room. You notice tone shifts, micro expressions, subtle dynamics. That's not weakness, that's awareness. But if that awareness is only used to adjust yourself instead of reveal yourself, you become highly adaptable, not deeply connected. And the brain doesn't register adaptation as belonging, it registers congruence. When what you think, feel, and say aren't too far apart, your nervous system relaxes. I tested this once. In the middle of a conversation, instead of nodding along, I calmly said, I see that a bit differently. Nothing dramatic happened, but internally, something shifted. I felt present. The loneliness softened, not because the group changed, but because I did. Feeling lonely around others usually isn't about lacking people. It's about lacking permission. Permission to not always smooth things over. Permission to take up psychological space. Permission to let your internal world be visible, even slightly. This doesn't mean oversharing or turning dinner into a therapy session. It means narrowing the gap between who you are internally and how you show up externally. When that gap shrinks, your nervous system recalibrates, and you may notice something surprising. Most people in the room are editing themselves too. You're not the only one trying to be socially correct. The difference is that you're sensitive enough to feel the emptiness when connection lacks depth. So instead of asking, what's wrong with me? Maybe ask, am I allowing myself to show up? That shift turns loneliness from a verdict into information. It's not proof that you don't belong. It may simply mean you're wired for resonance, not performance. If this resonates, when do you feel it most? At work, with friends, with family? And if you want to keep exploring the subtle psychological patterns that shape how we connect, subscribe. We're not here to fix you. We're here to understand what's really happening beneath the surface.